Hi again, I'm Eugene Sakai with Studio S Squared Architecture, and with me today is Isabeau Guglielmo. And Isabeau and I are going to talk about Phase 1B, which applies for a lot of our projects. And this is the phase in which we will be focusing on getting you your planning permit. A planning permit is different from your building permit in a lot of senses, but Isabeau, would you mind maybe sharing for our clients what are the primary differences between a planning permit and a building permit?
So the planning permit is more of a simplified set. It's what's used to make sure that we comply with like zoning ordinances and conform with all those things. It's what the planning department's going to review. So we don't show a lot of things when it comes to like interiors and like specifics like that because the planning department doesn't really care. Whereas the building permit set is a complete set of plans that details everything from the exterior and the interior, and it's what the contractor can use to then build the home.
That's a great summary. Um, the thing that you touched on was that the planning department doesn't really care about the interior, which is an interesting point because a lot of our clients care sometimes more about the interior, but for the planning department, what they're looking at is the exterior from the standpoint of neighborhood compatibility, and oftentimes that is codified in the form of design guidelines. We have an example here of the design guidelines from the city of Palo Alto, which applies to any two-story home, either a remodeled or added onto two-story home or a new two-story home in Palo Alto. But a lot of cities that have a planning permit requirement often pair that with a mandate to comply with single family, in this case, individual review guidelines or design guidelines in the case of other cities. Isabeau, for yourself as an architect in our office who does a lot of initial design work, when you see a project in a jurisdiction that has design guidelines, how do you approach the project maybe a little bit differently, or what is your initial thought on a project where design guidelines apply?
Yeah, so it's important to be even more considerate of the context because a lot of what the design guidelines goal is for is to compare the home with the existing neighborhood and make sure that it's compatible. So it's good to get into Google Earth and see what the existing homes look like and see do a lot of the existing homes, are they low ranch style homes? Because that could limit the heights that you're allowed to do on the first story, for example. And it's important to know these. It depends on the jurisdiction, but it's important to know from experience. Some jurisdictions can be pickier about certain things. For example, in some jurisdictions, we know that like they want to limit the first story height. So maybe what we do is we go a little higher than we end up wanting to go, knowing that they're going to ask us to step down the height. And that way we can step it down to what we're actually happy with, just in anticipation. But it's also something that we need to tell the clients ahead of time too. If, for example, they want to design a very contemporary home in a very traditional neighborhood, we want to tell them that these design review guidelines and the planners might push back a bit, and we might have to make some compromises in the design in order to satisfy them. Even if the design is completely conforming with zoning ordinances and codes, it's these subjective guidelines that one planner might say, oh, it's fine, it conforms, whereas another planner might not think it conforms at all and want us to make certain changes just based on their own preferences.
It's a really good summary of it. I think one of the main differences between design guidelines and the zoning ordinance is really that one word you said, subjective. Even though a lot of times guidelines have specific little drawings and vignettes like the ones that Palo Alto is showing, they are still subject to a lot of interpretation. What is one person's version of appropriate might be another planner's version of something that doesn't comply or does not meet the guidelines. So I think, would you say, Isabeau, that it's important in a situation like this for a client to be maybe somewhat flexible as we go through this process?
Yeah, definitely. Just to keep in mind that there's things that may inhibit what they want to produce, even if it's completely up to codes and all this kind of stuff. There's these subjective planners that may inhibit, and they might have to make some compromises along the way in order to achieve a design that they're really happy with. But it's not necessarily all the original decisions that they might have wanted, just because of these subjective design guidelines.
Correct. One of the things that we often tell our clients as they're about to embark through a process involving subjective review is it's not really so important what we first submit, but rather what we can get approved. And, so I think that's a good way to look at a proposal. An initial proposal or application is really just that. It's likely to get tweaked and adjusted along the way. So it's really best to not fall in love with what is originally submitted, and therefore kind of keep your sanity by having realistic expectations about the process.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to take a fairly deep dive as we look at the process map into the various components that go into a planning permit package. But just as a broad overview here, they typically require a full site plan, including landscape, irrigation, civil, grading and drainage plans. Sometimes a planning permit leads directly into a public hearing, which we will talk about at length in our Phase 1C video. If that applies, please take a look at that video. Timelines for planning permit review are generally governed by the California Permit Streamlining Act, which is basically a state ordinance that talks about prescribed timelines for environmental review as dictated by the state of California. It dates back to 1977. And essentially, for our clients, what they need to know is that nearly every submittal, whether it's an initial submittal or a resubmittal, basically has a 30-day review cycle. That's supposed to be the maximum cycle, after which a city is compelled to respond with a letter of review. And generally, they will take the full 30 days, regardless of how small the changes upon a resubmittal might be. You can expect them to take the full 30 days each time. So one of the things that you'll need to do during this phase, and pretty early on in this phase, is start thinking about your landscape architecture design. Most planning permits require a full landscape design for the front yard and the rear yard as part of the design submittal. So typically, that would be done by a licensed landscape architect. Studio S Squared can also do your landscape architecture. If that is your preferred choice, we will partner with a landscape architect who is a longtime partner of the firm. And together we will provide you with the same level of service that a landscape only firm would do. Isabeau, in your experience, landscape architecture is something that obviously is pretty important to not only a planning permit package, but how would you say it's also important to the overall design?
It's very important to the overall design because we want to create a house that has a flow between the interior and the exterior. So we want the landscape design to mesh not only with the exterior of the home, but with the interior. So we always send the landscape architect a 3D model, our site plan, and some images of the exterior design so that they can get a feel for the style of home that you want. And they can make a landscape plan that's cohesive with that, and they can create spaces in the exterior that also work well with spaces in the interior and with the client's overall desires. So it feels kind of like a cohesive design and not a separate landscape design and separate home design.
Yeah, that's a great point. The word you use there, cohesive, I think that's really something that we strive for on all of our projects, regardless of the style or the aesthetic of the client. Whatever their aesthetic may be, we want the whole project to tie together, from the building to the architecture to the interiors to the landscape. These firms here that are listed at the top are all excellent landscape architecture firms whom we've worked with successfully over the years. You can click on any of these links to see their websites. And as I mentioned, if you'd like to consider us as your landscape architect, just let us know. So there are some additional homework assignments during this phase that we strongly encourage you to consider doing. So most planning permits have what is called a neighborhood notification component. Isabel, why don't you talk a little bit about what that typically looks like?
Yeah, so most jurisdictions require that you reach out to your neighbors and sometimes send them a shortened set of the plans before you actually submit to the planning department. So this could include exterior perspectives, elevation, site plan, nothing on the interior. They don't need to know what's going on there, but just the exterior stuff that could affect them. And that we found that it's best to do this if you reach out to them, even if it's not required, because then if they have any questions or concerns, they can talk with you directly instead of bringing those concerns to the planning department, which could trigger one of their subjective opinions into thinking, oh, maybe this doesn't fit with the neighborhood because we're getting all these comments from the neighbors. Whereas if that's something that you discuss with the neighbors on your own, then they're less likely to want to appease the neighbors and push back about something in order to do so. So we recommend hosting like a wine and cheese or something like that, where you invite your neighbors over, show them the plans, discuss with them if they have any concerns that are minor, that's something that we could make that change to appease them so that then they approve of the plans and they don't push back later or complain to the planning department about the plans, then that's great. Or if they're happy with the plans, that's great. And we can give them this letter that they can sign, because it's always great to show that the neighbors are behind your project. Especially if there is one neighbor that comes out and says something against your project. If you can show that you have 10 in support of your project, then that says so much more. So it's always great that you do this, and it's also a good way to get to know your neighbors, and just to create a good environment. And the planning department looks really well on this. They'll often ask, has any neighborhood outreach been conducted? How did that go? And if they find out there's none been conducted, then they see that very unfavorably, especially if there is pushback.
Yeah, it's sort of it's a necessary part of the process, but it doesn't have to be scary. You know, sometimes in certain cases, you as the client or homeowner might not know your neighbors very well, but look at it as an opportunity to get to know them a little bit better. The other thing to think about is that when a neighbor gets a notification of your project in the mail, typically it's going to be basically a set of plans or maybe a letter linking them to the city's website where they can see the plans. They're not going to have the benefit of someone explaining the design to them. And that's where you can come in as a homeowner. I mean, let's face it, a lot of lay people don't understand how to read plans. And if they get the planning package drawings, they might not fully understand what the design is or how it impacts them.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes just having a face to the project, your face as the homeowner, to explain to them your design and how it's going to fit in and hopefully not impact them, can make all the difference, really. A lot of people are afraid of the unknown when it comes to new development. And sometimes they're a little bit afraid of who you are. So you having this meeting can kind of assuage their concerns on both fronts. You can explain the project, get to know them a little better, and hopefully, as Isabeau said, head off some of these letters and emails that planners might get saying, oh gosh, you know, there's a lot of neighborhood concern about this project. A lot of times it's because maybe, you know, the outreach effort wasn't quite as strong as it could have been.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, great. The other thing that you can do, as you'll see on the flow chart, which we'll touch on next, there is a fair amount of downtime during this phase. And that goes back to those 30-day review cycles that we talked about. That goes to basically waiting for the city process to play out. So we would like to keep you busy and kind of keep your project moving forward during that downtime as much as possible. So one thing that you can do that would be very helpful to prepare your project for the next phase, um, start thinking about your phase two interior design coming up. And the best way to do that is to begin assembling your house interior idea books. We've talked about house in our previous video. As you know, it's a great website. It's a great library of images. The next phase is when we're going to really start drilling down on your interior likes and preferences room by room. So for an explanation of how to best do that, please contact our interior design director, and she will get you going on the right way to do that most efficiently. So we're going to close out this video by taking a look at the process map for this phase. As you can see, it's a little bit more complex than the one we looked at for phase 1A, primarily in that there are more moving parts outside just our firm and you as the homeowner. Namely, we have outside design firms involved, as shown in green, and probably most importantly, we have your local planning department, whether it's the county or the city planning department, really being the gatekeepers of your project and whether or not we can move forward as designed or as revised. So we're going to go through this very briefly, just so you can understand quickly, sort of the various steps and the various moving parts here. Um, really, the process starts out with you onboarding the landscape architect. Simultaneous to that, Studio S Squared will be preparing our portion of the planning permit drawings, which we'll go over in a second. This is also a good time while the drafting and design work is going on for you to begin some of those neighborhood outreach efforts. So talking to your neighbors, bringing those blank form letters around for hopefully their signature of approval, et cetera, et cetera. You will be working directly with the landscape architecture firm to flesh out the site design, basically kind of everything outside the footprint of the building. And what we like the landscape architect to focus on first is the hardscape plan. Isabel, why don't you take us through the kind of the consultant or really the site design experts process here, starting with the hardscape plan.
Yeah, so the hardscape plan is the first thing we like to get because it's the long lead item. So the landscape architect is going to work on the landscape plans. You're going to provide comments that you might have, and then once the landscape plans are finalized and you're happy with them, the landscape architect will send us the hardscape plan while they finish working on the planting plan and any irrigation requirements that they might have. This way we can incorporate this hardscape into our site plan, and civil will then be able to start on their grading and drainage plan once we send them this site plan with the incorporated hardscape. And then that way civil can be working on that and landscape can be working on the planting plan while we finalize our plans. And it's not one group waiting on one group waiting on one group. It's all groups finalizing together.
Mm-hmm.
And then once we receive the finalized plans from all the consultants, we'll be doing a quick check through to make sure that everything matches. They are using the right base file. They didn't put something where the house should have been, anything like that. We'll do a final check of the consultant plans against them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a perfect summary. And tell us a little bit about the arborist's role in all of this, if you would.
Yeah, so the arborist is very important, especially if you're getting rid of any trees, because certain trees are considered protected if they're over a certain species and over a certain size. And in order to remove these trees, you have to basically show the planning department that you have good reason for this, whether it's you're not going to be able to build a decently sized home if you keep the tree or something like that, or the tree is in poor health, then that's a good way to remove it as well. But if you do remove a protected tree, there's more requirements for replacement, which is why it's important for the arborist and landscape architect to work together there. And then also if there's any street trees, basically the arborist will just rate all the trees on their health and whether they're protected or not. So that way, if any are being removed, you know the ramifications and you know what needs to be done to replace any.
That's perfect. And just a reminder to those of you looking at the video, a lot of these cells here have links. So for example, if you wanted to see what an arborist tree protection plan looks like, just click on this link and one will pop up. We're going to show you very briefly what a completed planning submittal package looks like. This was for a project we did, I think in 2017, 2018. For a project in Los Altos in the unincorporated area. So that's why the actual governing jurisdiction was Santa Clara County. But as Isabeau mentioned, you know, it's not just the architecture plans that get submitted. As you can see, if I zoom in a little bit here, you know, we have various professionals involved at this early stage. The architect, the geotechnical engineer, the civil engineer, landscape architect, and arborist, all of whom we just touched on. And at this point, the set of plans, as Isabeau mentioned, it starts to look a lot more detailed than you might have seen from us in phase 1A, but it is still a far cry from a buildable construction ready set. These are the typical sheets that we would have, architectural mostly, but then also some civil and some landscape. Isabeau, when you are putting a planning permit package together, what would you say is the biggest challenge? What do you look for in a good planning permit set?
I think it's important to look at the requirements because every jurisdiction is different and every jurisdiction is going to have a different set of requirements that's needed in the plans and also a different set of zoning guidelines and zoning ordinances that you have to follow. So it's good to do your research before you start to put together the planning package. And this also helps if you find out, oh, we need this consultant on board for this that we don't need in most other jurisdictions. You can get them on board right as you're starting the planning package instead of realizing later on that you need them on board, and then that can hold up the planning package. So it's just important to know everything that you need and what the rules are, and it helps if you've done a project in that jurisdiction before because some things might not be specifically stated on the requirements, but it's something that you know the planners always ask you to add to the plans, so you can preemptively add them during the first submittal and cut back on the number of comments that they give you.
That's terrific. Yeah, certainly having, because of, again, the subjective nature of a lot of these comments, sometimes if you're not familiar with a jurisdiction, you can get blindsided by how subjective things can be. But if you've done a number of projects within a certain jurisdiction, hopefully that won't be the case. But as you can see, it's a fairly detailed set of plans that ends up having to be produced for really what amounts to a design review. And so it's a fairly time-consuming process. It's fairly involved. But rest assured, our firm is well experienced at shepherding your consultants and our own firm, of course, through the effort required to make this level of detail in a permit-ready set. After we submit the package, similar to what we just showed you, the planning department will have 30 days, and they will take all 30 days, as I mentioned, to review and produce their notice of incomplete letter. No matter how complete our drawings are, it always inevitably results in this letter, which they call an incomplete letter, because essentially they're looking for more information about the project in order to perfect the application or to answer all the questions they might have about certain details about your project. So on screen, I have here a typical notice of incomplete letter. As you can see, there's the word right there in bold.
Your audio keeps breaking out.
Okay. What about now?
Now it's better.
Okay. All right. So what I have on screen here is a typical notice of incomplete letter. It's for the project that we showed you earlier. And essentially what it is a request for more information from us before they feel the application is complete to their satisfaction. So Isabeau, when our firm receives one of these letters, typically what is your process for analyzing the information?
So the first thing is to read through all the comments and make sure that there's nothing impactful that may require design changes. If there is, then it's important for us to meet with the client, discuss the comments, and discuss how we think we can address these comments in order to satisfy the planners. And then if we do, when we do address those comments, we like to meet with the planners before formally resubmitting, just to make sure, will these changes satisfy your comments, so that we don't have to go through another submittal process and another 30 days in case they don't end up satisfying the planner's comments. And if they do, then we can get working on the revised set and resubmit. If there are no impactful design related comments, then we'll go through and we'll mark up the review letter with which consultant is responsible for which comment, just so that we make sure they don't miss anything, and then we'll send it out to the consultants along with a revised base file so that they can start working on the revised sheets.
So what Isabeau just described is essentially the process in this last leg of the journey here through phase 1B, where we receive the letter, we review the comments, we distribute them, the team revises, our firm revises, we coordinate the revised plans, we resubmit, and then typically the planning department will do another round of review after 30 days. We'll get their comments. Hopefully at that point, they'll deem the application complete. Or if it's still incomplete, we may have to go back through the whole cycle again with a second letter of incomplete and go through this again. That's rare, but it does happen occasionally. More often though, is at this point after the second review cycle, we will get what's called your condition of approval letter, which looks like this. And essentially talks about the conditions that must be met in order for them to grant a building permit. So these are things that we would need to incorporate into what is our phase 3 set of documents, or our building permit construction documents set. And so these are requirements that must be satisfied in that future set of plans. But essentially this is the letter that closes out this phase. And allows us to move on to either phase 2 if you don't have a public hearing involved, or phase 1C if there is a public hearing involved. So take a look at either of those 2 videos and we'll see you there. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.